Open up UiPath, and then we're going to create our framework. So come here and select ReFramework. You can select any name that you would like in any location, and you can also update the description, and then just go ahead and select create. The UiPath has loaded, and you may see that it found some errors here, but just ignore those. Not sure why it's doing it. We can go in and look and see why it's happening, but it won't affect the bot. So just go ahead and select auto hide, and then you can maximize this window, and then you should see your interface look somewhat like this, or you may have an older version where the project and the activities are here, the library and the project. But at any rate, the bot will still work the same. So no worries if your interface doesn't look like mine. It just means that you have an older version. For some reason, UiPath, whenever I launch it, it forces me to update. So that's why my interface may look a little different than yours. So now let's discuss our design at a high level. We will be using our Excel files that we read from the email, and then we will process those using our SEC website and our Yahoo website. Now, a design best practice would have us to create two different bots. One project or one bot will be used to load those files to the UiPath orchestrator. And then once we have that done, we can have several bots run each transaction from UiPath orchestrator. And that's what we're going to do. So again, we're going to design our bot by using two different processes. One will be our loader and one will be our process handler. And in this video right here, we're going to go at a high level overview of how the framework should be utilized. So here we have our init state. And if you remember in our video earlier, we discussed the different state machines. So this here is our init state. And in our init state, we have our read, config, and initialize applications. So let's go inside of this and see what's happening. So in the beginning, we set our system error to nothing. And then if this is the first run, meaning if this is the first time that we run, because we're going to run multiple times depending on what our result comes here, we will either come here or come back to our init. Now, if this is the first run, the very first time that we run it in this transaction, then it will read our config file and it will initialize all of our settings, meaning it will grab all of our variable names from the config file and all of our settings from the config file. And then it will kill all processes because we're assuming that something may be lingering from an existing process. So we're going to kill all the processes that we would probably have open, and then we're going to initialize our application. And then this is all within a try catch. And if you're not familiar with a try catch, the try is what we're trying to do. And then if there's an error that exists whenever we're trying to do, we want to catch those errors and then do something about it. So in our try, we're trying to initialize all of our applications. And then in our catch, if we catch some kind of exception, we're just going to mark that exception as an error. And then we will notice down here, this is how we get either to our end process or to get data transaction data. It's based on whether or not we was successful or there was a system error. So let's look at our success. So our success is just saying if the system error is nothing, then we can go to success. And we can go to the transaction, the next state here, but I just want to go back so it'll be clear. So that was a success. Now this is the system error. Now, if the system error, this right here is the next one. If you remember, this was the first one. If system error is nothing, meaning it has no system error, then we can go successfully to the get transaction data. However, if the system error is not nothing, meaning that it is something, then we will log this. And we have different logs. We have the fatal, the error, warning, info, or trace, and those coincide with these here. We have error, warning, information, and trace. Now this here is a fatal because something happened to our system that we could not launch it. Again, this is our system. We're initializing our system. So if something happens, then we're going to go directly to our end process. And if nothing happened, like meaning we were successful, then we will come to the get transaction data. Now let's look at the end process. So the end process is a similar way. We have everything within a try catch, and in our try, we're going to try to close all of our applications that we may have had open based on our initialization. So if we initialize some application in a web browser, then if for whatever reason we've hit an error, then we want to come here, we want to close all of those applications. And then if anything that happens within here, we also want to log this as a warning and then kill the process. Now, if this was a success, we will come to our get transaction. In our get transaction, we have a check stop signal. And this is if we're running our process from orchestrator, and then if one of our admins or someone tries to stop the process, they would click stop or cancel, and then the bot would read that and say, hey, we need to stop, and then it will stop it and it'll log a message saying that the stop process was requested. If there was no stop process, it will log it and say stop process was requested. And then we'll come here to transaction item equals nothing, meaning there was no transactions. And we'll see why we do that in a bit. Now, if there was no stop process, then we would get the transaction data. And we do this all within a try catch as well. And again, if there's any exceptions, we have our exception. And in all of our try catches, you will see that we also have a finally block. And we'll show you how this works when we look at the process XAML, or the process state, I'm sorry. Now, inside of this, we have our arguments. And arguments are, if you remember, are things that we pass to our workflow that we are invoking. And if you come here and you select edit, and we can see all of the arguments that we're passing to our workflow. Now, the conditions for our get transaction to decide whether or not we end this or go to the process transaction, these are the conditions. So the new transaction, meaning if we're going to go to the process transaction, then transaction item is not nothing, meaning that we have some kind of transaction item that we got from our transaction data, from our get transaction data. However, if the transaction item is nothing, meaning we didn't get any transaction items, then we'll log it, and then we'll go to end process. And so let's take a step back and let's look at this get transaction data. So again, if this item, whenever we run this, whenever we invoke this transaction, if we get some items back, then we will go to process transaction. If there's nothing, then we will go to end process. Let's open up our get transaction real quick. This is how it looks, but we're going to change this. So inside of our get transaction, what we're going to do is in our bot loader, we're going to read the emails inside of here, get those Excel files and save them to some folder. Okay. So now let's go back. Now, assuming that we did get, if we didn't get any data from the emails, there were nothing, then we're going to end the process. And if there was something, we'll come here, and then once it does this, it'll come back and it'll see, hey, there were no more emails, then it'll end the process. Now, let's say there are transactions that we got back. We did read the emails and we did download the Excel files. We're going to come to the process transaction. And then this is where we're going to read. This is where we're going to do all of our processing by extracting the data from the SEC site and the Yahoo site. Now, by default, it has this business rule exception as nothing. And this is the same thing that we saw earlier when it said the system error was nothing. So it has the business rule set as nothing, and then it tries to process this. And then if there was an error thrown, we're going to catch it. And so if our business rule comes back as an exception, meaning there is a business exception, and I'm not sure if we discussed it, but the difference between a business exception and a regular exception or a system exception is if the business exception are those type of exceptions that the business has to correct. Maybe the data is incorrect, or the data was not in the folder, or whatever those kind of reasons that the bot itself cannot handle, then those are business exceptions. Exceptions are system exceptions, internal exceptions, and all other kind of exceptions. So system exceptions are those that the bot maybe failed to find this element, the bot may failed at this step, or the application most likely wasn't open, or something to that effect. Now, if there was a business exception, then we catch that exception, and then we will mark the exception as the business exception. Now, if it was a system exception, then we mark it as a system exception. And then finally, we're going to set our transaction status based on either the business rule, the system exception, or the successful. Now, inside of here, we're going to open this up here, the set transaction example, so you'll see what's going on. And you can read this information, is very important, and you just take your own time to read this. Now, what's happening is, based on whether or not we have a system exception or business exception, come back here. So we have our business exception, system exception, or if everything was successful when we tried to process this. We have these three different branches. We have the success, and then the success will, if we're using a queue, it will set the transaction status, then we'll log a message, and then we'll remove any transaction log files, and then we will increment our transaction number. Transaction number equals +1. And then we will add our retry, we will reset it to 0, because if inside of our config file, we set our retry to at least 2 times, and I'll go over that in a minute. If we set it to 2 times and it was successful, then we're going to initialize this back to 0, because it could have retried 1 time and then incremented up to 1 and then 2, and then once it's finally successful, it'll say, okay, set it back to 0. Now, if there was an exception, meaning this right here, it said, the condition is business exception nothing and system exception nothing. Meaning if there is no business exception and no system exception, yes means it's true. However, if there was either a business exception or a system exception, then we'll come here. And now we'll say, okay, we know that there was either a business exception or a system exception. Was it a business exception? And if it was a business exception, then we'll come here. If it wasn't, then by default, it had to be a system exception. And then we'll do a similar thing here with these. We'll log our message, do our increment our transaction, because we're going to get the next transaction if it's a business exception. So if you remember, if our process fails because of business exception, then there's nothing that we can do for that transaction, and we just increment it and go on to the next one. So it's similar to what the success is, with the exception of we're going to be going to the next record, and we're going to be setting this as a business exception. Now, the system exception is handled a little bit different. Here, we're going to, if we have our queue set as retry, then we will handle that information. And then we're going to come here to our robot retry. And then inside of our robot retry, you just have to kind of read through this. So it's saying that if our config file is greater than 0, then we will see if we've reached our max retries. If yes, then log an error. If not, then we're going to retry. And then if it's not set as greater than 0, then we are going to increment our transaction. And now let's open up the config file so that this will make a little bit more sense. But as we go down, we'll see that we'll take a screenshot of the exception, and then we'll close all of our applications. And then coming back to the main, we'll see this is how it looks. So if it's successful, then we come back and get the next transaction. If it's a business exception, then we come back and get the next transaction. And if there's an error, then we come here and we initialize our applications. And based on the number of retries, we would retry this same transaction. If we've reached our maximum retries, or if we do not have our retries set, then we will increment our transaction item and go to the next one. If we have not met our transaction, then we will retry the same transaction. Now let's see how that looks. And we also want to open up our config file. Just come here to project, and you can select this, File Explorer. It'll open up this. Then we can come to data, and then we can open up our config file. So as we look at our config file, if we come over here to constants, we will see that we have a maximum number of retry, and we set it by default as 0. And if you read this, it says must be set to 0 if using orchestrated queues. If greater than 0, the bot will retry the same transaction which failed with application exception. So again, that just simply means that when we are looking at our set transaction, and if there's an exception, then we're going to come to this path and see, first of all, is it set to greater than 0? If it is, then it means we're going to retry. If not, then we're going to come here to this path and we're going to increment it. So let's go back to this part. Let me close this transaction data out. And that is how the UiPath ReFramework is to be utilized. I hope this video was clear. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email or send me a comment. And just for clarity, I believe the reason why we're getting this error message here is because we do not have the UiPath credentials installed. And we see here our activities, we do not have it installed for our dependencies. And if you're having that issue, then you may want to go to our packages, and then let's see if that'll work. Yep, credential, uninstall. For some reason, say update. See if that'll help. And that did seem to clear that out. Let's see about our error message. It most likely won't go away until we clear it. And now if we open it up, if we close this and open it back up, I think this error message will go away. So if you want to clear this error, and if you have it, then that means just your UiPath credentials need to be updated, okay? Thanks for watching. Hope to see you in the next video.